If you open the game with d4, when black responds with knight f6, if you're not exactly thrilled to learn all of the mainline theory after white's most popular choice, c4, then you may consider less theoretically demanding, but nevertheless perfectly sound openings. We're going to focus on two d4 sidelines that contain more than a drop of poison and should not be underestimated by black. These systems are both based upon playing a quick bishop g5, either immediately or by first playing knight f3. Let's start with the most direct choice, bishop g5. This opening is known as the Trompowsky attack. White immediately confronts black's knight on f6, potentially creating an early material imbalance with bishop takes f6, doubling black's pawns at the cost of surrendering the bishop pair. Black certainly doesn't have to fear this exchange, but let's take a look at what happens when black directly challenges this bishop with knight e4, centralizing the knight and attacking the bishop on g5. One creative choice for white is to play h4, inviting black to capture the bishop with knight takes g5 in order to grab space on the king side and open up the h-file for the rook with h takes g5. This move enjoyed some popularity in the 1990s, but white players are no longer as enthusiastic about this exotic move, perhaps due to black's strong replies d5 or c5. So in response to this knight lunge, white tends to play bishop f4, avoiding the exchange while supporting the center and adding pressure against black's queen side. If black gets overly excited and continues to chase the Trompowsky bishop, then black can play the risky g5. White should welcome this overly committal choice and may calmly return the bishop to its original square with bishop c1. Although it appears black is pushing white around, the opposite will soon become the case. White intends to evict the knight with f3 when the g5 pawn suddenly becomes a target, and white will likely expand in the center with e4, gaining serious momentum, so this is not a promising way to challenge the Trompowsky. Instead of trying to chase white's bishop, a more solid option to consider is supporting the knight with d5. White can certainly challenge the knight with f3, but now that black enjoys greater control over the e4 square, this idea is less threatening. White may prepare to add pressure against the knight with e3 and bishop d3, when black may support the knight with bishop f5, as well as preparing to strike in the center with c5. But if black is in the mood for sharper play, then a dynamic option is c5, confronting white's center while opening up a diagonal for black's queen. When white develops the dark-squared bishop early, c5 is a common pawn break for black, especially as b2 is no longer protected, so attacking the space left behind with queen b6 becomes a common theme to keep in mind. In response to c5, white can grab more space with d5, or play more ambitiously with f3. If black decides to retreat the knight with knight f6, white can keep the game in calmer waters with the space-gaining d5, or try to challenge black's early pawn break with d takes c5. The adventurous viewer may be interested in exploring the creative and risky pawn sacrifice b6, trying to seize the initiative, but a more direct path for black is to regain the pawn with queen a5 check. White can actively respond to the check by playing knight c3. When black regains the pawn with queen takes c5, white traded the d4 pawn for black's c5 pawn, so after white grabs space in the center with e4, play resembles a Sicilian defense, a popular opening against e4 on the first move. White can focus on rapid development with queen d2 and castle queenside, when black's queen on c5 may prove a bit vulnerable as white builds a dangerous initiative. After attacking the knight with f3, knight f6 is certainly a sensible response, but black can also choose to first counterattack with queen a5 check. With black's knight still on e4, white no longer has the option of playing knight c3. So blocking with the pawn makes more sense. After provoking white's pawn to c3, black may decide to retreat the knight to f6. White typically responds to this move with the space-gaining pawn thrust d5. If black continues passively, a quick e4 and e5 can be highly unpleasant. So black exerts pressure against white's queen side with queen b6, highlighting the space white's dark-squared bishop left behind on b2. If you want to provoke complications at any cost, e4 leads to a controversial double pawn sacrifice that you can explore. Defending the pawn with b3 is also possible, but a more solid path is to simply retreat the bishop with bishop c1, defending the b2 pawn without weakening the queenside structure. At first glance, this may appear to be passive play from white, but don't forget that white enjoys a space advantage in the center with d5. If black does not play actively, white can play moves such as c4, supporting the center while preparing knight c3 and e4. With this in mind, black can challenge white's center with e6, adding pressure against d5, so white expands in the center and defends the pawn with e4. Black can open up the e-file after the exchange of pawns e takes d5, e takes d5. White is ready to play c4, supporting the center, followed by knight c3, bishop d3, and knight g to e2, followed by castling kingside. Before white completes this comfortable setup, Grandmaster Bhaskaran Adhiban, known for his creative attacking style, played the ambitious bishop d6. This move may feel a bit strange, especially as it blocks the d-pawn, and by extension, the light-squared bishop. But it does develop the bishop to an active diagonal pointing toward white's kingside, as well as preparing to castle quickly. Black's lead in development should not be underestimated, as white's king remains in the center, while the kingside pieces are still slumbering on their original squares. One interesting choice is to take space and support d5 with c4, and another interesting path is knight a3, threatening a potential fork with knight c4. Black simply ignored this idea and castled. If white continues with knight c4, black is prepared to respond with rook e8 check. It appears white does not have a positive choice, but white is prepared to escape the check with king f2, when white's king is surprisingly secure for the time being, allowing white to catch up on kingside development without any serious problems. As you can see, the Trompowsky is able to create some dynamic, unbalanced, and highly original positions, so the more experienced player will often enjoy a serious practical advantage. Instead of knight c4, white decided to play the sensible as well as tricky bishop d3, beginning to develop white's kingside, pointing the bishop toward black's castled king. This move invites black to grab a pawn with knight takes d5. Although bishop takes h7 check, discovering the queen's attack against the unprotected knight looks tempting, this is actually not such a favorable line, especially as white can play the crushing knight c4, forking the queen and bishop, preparing to meet queen c7. With the forcing sequence knight takes d6, queen takes d6, attracting black's queen to the d-file in order to play bishop e4, attacking the now pinned knight on d5, if black tries to pin the bishop with rook e8, hoping white will blunder the queen with queen takes d5, queen takes d5, taking advantage of the pinned bishop. This is easily resolved by knight e2, unpinning the bishop when black cannot avoid losing a piece. Instead of falling for this trick by capturing the pawn, black can take advantage of the open e-file with rook e8 check. White continues to develop and blocks the check with knight e2. Now that knight c4 is in the air, black played the prophylactic bishop f8, preparing to reroute the bishop on the long diagonal with g6 and bishop g7. The game continued with the tempo-gaining knight c4. Black's queen is running out of useful squares, so it returned home with queen d8. White supported the center with knight e3, when black played d6, blocking the d5 pawn while preparing queenside development. After white castled, black developed his knight with knight b to d7. White has no shortage of options. These choices include grabbing space on the queenside with a4, reinforcing the center with c4, discouraging knight e5 with f4, or improve the position of the knight with knight g3, preparing a potential kingside attack. Black should remain alert for resources including knight e5 if allowed, attacking the light-squared bishop, and supporting a future space-gaining pawn thrust c4. Black will also likely redevelop the dark-squared bishop with the kingside fianchetto, creating interesting, double-edged play. Instead of playing knight e4, black can allow white the option to play bishop takes f6, surrendering the bishop pair in order to damage black's pawn structure. King's Indian players may like to play g6, although doubling black's pawns with bishop takes f6, forcing e takes f6, may not be the typical structure they are used to defending. One solid option popular at Grandmaster level is to simply play d5, staking a claim in the center, not worrying about white compromising the pawn structure. If white focuses on development with e3, then black can actively strike in the center with c5. White can also decide to double black's pawns with bishop takes f6. G takes f6 is an ambitious choice that can be explored, but a more straightforward as well as solid response is e takes f6. White enjoys the superior pawn structure and can focus on supporting the center with e3. White is often aiming to increase pressure against black's d5 pawn with c4, or even a kingside fianchetto with g3 and bishop g2. With this in mind, black may reinforce the center with c6. A more ambitious idea for black is to strike in the center immediately with c5, adding pressure against white's center while trying to open up lines for the bishop pair. In addition to the doubled f-pawns, black is willing to accept an isolated queen's pawn after d takes c5, promoting dynamic piece play in exchange for a compromised structure. A more popular choice is to play bishop d6, actively developing the dark-squared bishop while remaining flexible regarding the future pawn structure. Simple development with bishop d3 and knight f3 are options to consider, as well as supporting the center with knight d2, but a direct option for white is c4. Challenging black's center. If black supports the center with c6, then white can saddle black with an isolated queen's pawn after c takes d5. Black usually decides to avoid this with d takes c4. Bishop takes c4. White has compromised black's pawn structure and has gained a central pawn majority in exchange for giving black the bishop pair, creating an interesting long-term positional imbalance. In one high-level encounter, Grandmaster Lei Kuang Liam reveals an instructive continuation for black, starting with f5. At the expense of restricting the light-squared bishop, black advances one of the doubled pawns, opening up the f6 square, preparing to centralize the knight with knight d7 to f6. The pawn also restricts the e4 square in case white wants to expand in the center with e4. And on a really good day, black wouldn't mind being able to play f4, undoubling the f-pawns with f takes e3, although this is unlikely to happen anytime soon. His opponent, Grandmaster Anton Korobov, focused on straightforward development with knight c3. Black activated his knight with knight d7, eyeing the f6 square. White centralized the other knight with knight f3. When both sides castled, black continued with c6, helping restrict activity on the d5 and b5 squares, and possibly supporting the pawn thrust b5 if necessary. Grandmaster Korobov decided to play a3. Since it's difficult to expand in the center, white creates the possibility of playing b4 and hinting at a minority attack with a future b5. Black centralized the queen with queen e7. When after queen c2, adding pressure against f5 while connecting the rooks, black responded with knight f6, centralizing the knight while revealing the light-squared bishop's protection of the f5 pawn. Black's light-squared bishop soon moved to d7, and in response to white's eventual expansion on the queen side with b4, b5 was played, followed by a5, trying to open up lines on the queen side. White later struck in the center with d5, creating interesting complications, the type of imbalanced middle game one can come to expect in such lines. d5 is a solid way to respond to the Trompowsky, but black may also consider the more ambitious c5, striking in the center, provoking immediate complications. In one high-profile blitz game, world champion Magnus Carlsen doubled black's pawns with bishop takes f6. E takes f6 is certainly possible, but the ever-creative grandmaster Vasily Ivanchuk decided to recapture with the g-pawn. Capturing with the g-pawn does isolate the h7 pawn, but it also opens up the g7 and h6 squares for black's bishop, often preparing to develop this piece on the long dark-squared diagonal with bishop g7. Carlsen resolved the central tension by grabbing space with d5. When black plays an early c5 against the Trompowsky, we are once again able to see the thematic queen b6, adding pressure against b2, provoking white to play queen c1. Grandmaster Ivanchuk's play will help us gain a sense of how black may activate the bishop pair in the middle game, creating dynamic attacking chances in the process. He started his plan with f5, controlling the e4 square and opening up the long dark square diagonal to support bishop g7. White continued with c4, supporting the d5 pawn when black responded with d6, locking down the center while preparing queenside development. White continued with knight c3, when black played the familiar knight d7, eyeing the f6 square. White prepared to eventually fianchetto the light-squared bishop while also restricting the f5 pawn with g3. Black's bishop enjoys uncontested control over the long dark square diagonal with bishop g7. Both sides centralize their knights with knight f3 and knight f6. Black's knight is ready to jump into the e4 square, so white added more protection to e4 with knight d2. Grandmaster Ivanchuk was not discouraged and advanced with his plan anyway, playing the powerful knight e4. Adding pressure against white's queenside, look at how strong black's dark-squared bishop is down the long diagonal. After the exchanges, knight d takes e4, f takes e4, knight takes e4 would allow bishop takes b2, so after bishop g2, attacking the e4 pawn, Ivanchuk played queen b4, pinning the knight to the king while also attacking the c4 pawn. White decided to castle his king seemingly out of danger. When both sides collected weak pawns with queen takes c4, bishop takes e4. Notice that bishop takes c3, removing the defender of the bishop, does not win a piece after queen takes c3, as White's queen is now threatening the unprotected rook on h8. The immediate bishop h3 is a strong option, but Grandmaster Ivanchuk decided to provoke more weaknesses against the enemy kingside with h5. h4 is an unpleasant threat, trying to tear open the kingside, so White prevented this by playing h4 first. After softening White's kingside, Ivanchuk activated his light-squared bishop with bishop g4. Although the position remains approximately balanced, Black's dynamic position with two active bishops proved to be more practical to play, especially after Black castled queenside, resulting in a fantastic victory for Ivanchuk. Instead of provoking an imbalance with bishop takes f6, White may play the dynamic knight c3, preparing to meet c takes d4 with queen takes d4, a sharp option worth exploring. Another path to consider is simply grabbing space with d5. Black has no shortage of ideas, including knight e4, and since d5 opens up the long dark square diagonal, g6 is another option to explore. And Black can also decide to play as Grandmaster Ivanchuk did in another game with queen b6, once again adding pressure against the b2 pawn. White can certainly choose to defend the pawn with bishop c1, claiming Black's queen will prove somewhat misplaced in the long run. His opponent, Grandmaster Dmitry Andreikin, embraced the complications by entering the Vaganian gambit with knight c3. The Vaganian gambit focuses on rapid development, challenging Black to simply capture the pawn with queen takes b2, with the idea of playing bishop d2, supporting the knight, so rook b1 is now a threat, forcing queen a3, when knight b5, threatening the queen, as well as a fork on c7 is absolutely crushing. So Black understandably avoids this by playing queen b6. White decided to grab space in the center with e4, threatening to simply take over the center with e5. So Black sensibly discouraged this idea with d6. Grandmaster Andreikin marched forward with the space-gaining f4. White is prepared to rapidly develop with knight f3, bishop b5 check, followed by invading Black's territory with e5. White has good compensation for the pawn, enjoying a strong central presence as well as lead in development. Black has a variety of options, including counterattacking White's center with e6, trying to prevent White from expanding in the center by playing e5, and queen c7 has also been played, trying to support the center as well. This is a dangerous line for Black to enter without serious preparation. Grandmaster Andreikin went on to turn this initiative into a quick victory. Rather than allowing White to compromise Black's structure with bishop takes f6, or chasing White's bishop with knight e4, a solid alternative for Black is to play e6, simply supporting the center and preparing to meet bishop takes f6 with queen takes f6. White has some interesting options including knight f3, transposing into the Torre attack, which we'll soon explore. The flexible knight d2 is also an option, retaining some flexibility regarding the future of the dark-squared bishop. But White's most direct choice is to take space in the center with e4. This ambitious choice can create problems for Black, but this also suggests White must be willing to give up the bishop pair after Black's main response, h6. Since bishop h4 simply loses a pawn after g5, unpinning the knight with knight takes e4 to follow, White should play bishop takes f6, queen takes f6. Black collects the bishop pair without compromising the pawn structure, although Black's queen may prove somewhat misplaced on that square, making it vulnerable to attack. White has two main options to consider. One option is to simply develop the knight with knight f3. Black typically supports the center with d6, supporting the e5 square while also opening up the d7 square for Black's knight. White centralizes the other knight with knight c3. Instead of committing the bishop to the more passive e7 square, which also leaves the queen a bit awkwardly placed on f6, Black can play g6, preparing to fianchetto the dark-squared bishop on the long diagonal. The game may appear to be slowly building into a positional struggle, but Grandmaster Viktor Korchnoi sharpened the play with the thematic queen d2. preparing to castle queenside and focus his attention on attacking the kingside. His opponent, Grandmaster Anatoly Karpov, improved the queen's placement with queen e7, clearing some space for the dark-squared bishop on the long diagonal, while also preventing white from gaining a tempo against the queen if e5 is played. White continued with his plan by castling queenside, encouraging black to prepare a queenside pawn storm with a6. White initiated his kingside demonstration with h4. Karpov fianchettoed his dark-squared bishop with bishop g7. You may expect white to continue with an aggressive move such as g4 or h5, but Grandmaster Korchnoi played the interesting move g3. His idea was to meet Karpov's b5 with bishop h3. Knight d7 as well as castling kingside are interesting alternatives, but white was able to reveal his point after black played b4, attacking the knight, which allowed Victor to play the surprising knight d5, attacking the b4 pawn, as well as taking advantage of white's pressure on the h3 to c8 diagonal. Black responded with e takes d5, allowing white to play bishop takes c8. White is suddenly preparing bishop b7, attacking the rook as well as the d5 pawn. From a quiet-looking opening, the game has turned into a sharp battle with opposite-side castling. Grandmaster Korchnoi's energetic play resulted in defeating his eternal rival after an extended struggle. Instead of playing knight f3, white may also decide to support the center with c3. This move may look like a solid way to defend the center, but it also contains a fair amount of poison. White may be planning to complete development with bishop d3, knight e2, castle kingside, and strike in the center with f4. We see this plan in action after d6, bishop d3. Grandmaster Vishwanathan Anand, playing black, fights back in the center and grabs space with e5. His opponent, Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura, continued with white's typical plan, knight e2, keeping the f-file open for a quick f4. Grandmaster Anand played the sensible g6, preparing to meet castling with bishop g7. Grandmaster Nakamura expanded in the center with f4, threatening f takes e5, discovering an attack against black's queen. So Anand anticipated this idea with queen e7. White brought the other knight to the kingside with the maneuver knight d2, responding to castling with knight f3, intensifying the pressure against e5. So black played bishop g4, adding pressure against white's knight and aligning against the enemy queen. Nakamura centralized his queen and vacated the same diagonal as black's light-squared bishop with queen d2, when black brought his last minor piece into the action with knight d7, supporting the center but restricting the light-squared bishop, allowing white to force a minor piece exchange after h3, provoking bishop takes f3, rook takes f3. Anand played c5 immediately, when Nakamura responded with d takes e5, shutting in black's dark-squared bishop before advancing with f5. The game eventually ended in a draw, but another path for black to consider is first playing e takes d4. The point is that c takes d4 can now be met by c5. Black's dark-squared bishop now enjoys greater pressure down the long diagonal, as white's broad center is a bit more fragile, creating interesting complications. Rather than playing the immediate bishop g5, turning the game into the Trompowsky, white can play knight f3, developing the knight and preparing to meet g6, or e6, with bishop g5, turning the game into the Torre attack, which is typically a more positionally oriented, slower-paced opening compared to some of the sharp Trompowsky lines we examined. It's worth seeing how these two openings are related by looking at a different move order. Rather than playing knight f6, an annoying line for Trompowsky players is to face e6, inviting a French defense after e4 and d5. e6 prevents a quick bishop g5. This means that the Trompowsky is not a universal weapon, so white must be prepared to enter other lines. We reach the Torre attack after the moves knight f3, knight f6, and bishop g5. We have now transposed into a line that could have been reached by the Trompowsky after bishop g5 on the second move if black responded with e6, followed by white playing knight f3. One popular option for black is to play h6, but let's first consider black's typical strike against white's center with c5. White supports d4 with e3. Just like in the Trompowsky, black can target the vulnerable b2 pawn with queen b6. If white is willing to provoke complications, then the Torre pawn sacrifice knight b to d2 is a dynamic option to explore. In a high-level game played right here on chess.com, world champion Magnus Carlsen played the solid queen c1, defending the b2 pawn without compromising the pawn structure, when white is prepared to build a solid center with c3, leading to a slower-paced, more positional struggle. His opponent, Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura, grabbed space in the center with d5. Magnus built the typical Torre pawn center with c3. Left to his own devices, white's Torre development is fairly straightforward in most positions with bishop d3, castle kingside, and play knight b to d2, creating a solid position upon which to build. Black could certainly just focus on solid development with bishop e7, followed by castling kingside. But Grandmaster Nakamura played the interesting bishop d7. White's light-squared bishop can become a dangerous attacking piece with bishop d3, pointing directly toward black's kingside. Black's light-squared bishop is restricted by the pawn on e6, so black's idea is to exchange the light-squared bishops with bishop b5. Carlsen calmly continued to develop with knight b to d2, allowing Nakamura to execute his plan with bishop b5. Bishop takes b5 check. Queen takes b5. White's king is currently unable to castle, but Magnus solves this problem by attacking black's queen with a4. Hikaru maintains the tension on the f1 to a6 diagonal with queen a6. We may look at white's queen on c1 as a passive, somewhat misplaced piece, but in the hands of a world champion, he reveals its worth with a surprising pawn thrust, b4. Attacking black's c5 pawn with the point that after the exchanges c takes b4, c takes b4. The b4 pawn appears to be hanging, but white has opened up the c-file, threatening a deadly check on c8. So black responded to this with knight b to d7. Thanks to this tactical trick, white is able to achieve his positional aim, taking space and blocking the queen's pressure against white's kingside with b5. Since this was a blitz game, Nakamura had to make a quick decision. Queen a5, pinning the d2 knight may have been more accurate, preparing a possible knight e4. Instead of queen a5, black played queen b6, allowing white to play the accurate bishop f4, threatening to trap the queen with bishop c7. Bishop d6 would simply lose a piece after a5. So after queen d8, Carlsen applied positional pressure with bishop c7. Black did not want to block the dark-squared bishop with queen e7, so Nakamura played queen c8. Magnus sensibly castled his king. When after bishop e7, white intensified pressure on the queen side with rook a2, preparing to meet kingside castling with rook c2. White enjoys a comfortable advantage, with more active pieces and serious queenside pressure. In the hands of a superb positional player, the Torre attack can prove quite dangerous, as white can create a solid position upon which to build. Instead of striking against white's center immediately with c5, black can also challenge white's dark-squared bishop with h6, allowing white to enter the lines we studied in the Trompowsky with a quick bishop takes f6, followed by e4. But white can also keep the game in the Torre attack by maintaining the tension with bishop h4. Black has a variety of moves, including unpinning the knight with bishop e7, but a solid plan is to strike against white's center with c5, after white reinforces the center with e3. Instead of playing a quick queen b6, former world champion Anatoly Karpov demonstrated a solid plan for black. If allowed, white will likely support the center with c3, and possibly expand in the center with a well-prepared e4. So black decided to trade pawns with c takes d4, e takes d4, granting white a space advantage in the center for the time being, while also opening up the e-file for white's pieces. But black has also opened up the c-file for potential counterplay. Karpov unpinned the knight and prepared kingside castling with bishop e7. His opponent, Grandmaster Ivan Sokolov, activated his light-squared bishop with bishop d3, when black decided to castle, allowing white to grab more space with the double-edged c4, although this pawn may come under greater pressure on the c-file once black completes development and activates a rook on that file. This is an interesting path to explore, but Sokolov played the typical Torre move c3, supporting the center and building a solid pawn chain. We have seen situations when black's light-squared bishop remains passive, but without a pawn on d5, black prepares to activate the bishop on the long diagonal with b6. White centralized his queen and supported the center with queen e2, also preventing any possible bishop a6 ideas. Black activated the light-squared bishop with bishop b7. White developed his last minor piece with knight b to d2, At this point, Karpov could have played d6, preparing to complete development with knight b to d7, creating a resilient hedgehog structure. Instead, he decided to play knight c6, supporting the bishop on e7, which would become relevant if white castled kingside. Since white's Torre bishop remains more active than its counterpart on e7, black can play knight h5, preventing white from preserving the dark-squared bishop as the knight controls the g3 square. So after bishop takes e7, knight takes e7, black's position remains relatively solid with the potential threat of knight f4, forking the queen and light-squared bishop. The position is roughly balanced, but white may not be too enthusiastic about weakening the light squares with g3. Rather than castling, Sokolov decided to exchange the dark-squared bishop with bishop takes f6. Bishop takes f6. White decides to give up the bishop pair, a potential long-term problem, but eliminates the counterplay we observed after black was able to play knight h5. This is also a roughly balanced position, and white could simply decide to castle kingside with a solid game. But Sokolov decided to spice the game up with queenside castling, which eventually proved unsuccessful in this particular game. For would-be Trompowsky and Torre players, it's worth noting these systems are not universal, and after the classical response d5, unless white wants to play the pseudo-Trompowsky with bishop g5, a somewhat strange-looking choice without a knight on f6, then white will need to be prepared to play other options. If white plays the sensible knight f3, after knight f6, playing the Torre with bishop g5 is still a possibility, but it's less promising than other lines. In this case, white may consider transposing into the queen's gambit with c4, exploring the London system with bishop f4, or possibly playing an interesting waiting move such as c3. If white does decide to play bishop g5, since the knight is not pinned, this is well met by knight e4. Unlike the Trompowsky, when white could respond to knight e4 with a quick f3, the knight on f3 prevents this dynamic option. White can reply in similar fashion with bishop f4, although this does allow black to actively strike against white's center with c5. Black enjoys an active position and shouldn't encounter any serious problems out of the opening. That being said, if you're not worried about allowing your opponent to equalize right out of the opening, and you just want to play chess, this is not a terrible choice for white. If you're looking for a way to avoid the main lines, and still want to have the chance to create interesting positions that may challenge black, then the Trompowsky and Torre attack may be good weapons to add to your repertoire. As we learned in the video, black has no shortage of solid, as well as dynamic responses to consider, leading to plenty of interesting chances for both sides. Thanks for exploring these d4 sidelines, and best of luck the next time you find yourself in one of these positions from either side of the board.